Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gil McGowan. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the elected president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, Alberta's largest worker advocacy group. And on behalf of the AFL, I'd like to welcome everyone to the 8th in our series of virtual lunch and learns. Over the past few months, we've dealt with topics like healthcare and energy and revenue for public services. Today, we're going to be focusing on the need to strengthen K-12 education. And we're very happy to welcome our guests for today. Jorge Illanes, who's president of CUPE Local 3550, representing support staff at Edmonton Public Schools. Jorge has worked for Edmonton Public Schools for the past 20 plus years as an educational assistant, mostly in behavioral classrooms. He is a strong advocate and knows firsthand how undervalued support staff are when it comes to wages, equity, and working conditions. We're also joined today by Wing Lee, who is the Communications Director for Support Our Students, which is an Alberta-based public education advocacy organization. So welcome to both of you, Jorge and Wing. It's great to have you. I'm going to hand it over to them shortly, and we're going to talk about, have a conversation on 4 big issues: the current government mandate for K-12 education, and that conversation is going to include an update from Jorge on bargaining for the workers who he represents. We're also going to talk about how schools are funded and how this affects workers and students. Basically, the argument is what we say in the labor movement over and again, that working conditions are ultimately students' learning conditions. And finally, we're going to spend some time talking about privatization and the risks that it poses to the quality of education in our province. Now, after that, we can discuss and finally turn it over to open it up for Q&A. But before we start, just keep this in mind. Once we get to the Q&A portion, we'd like people to submit their questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So if you're new to Zoom, just take your cursor, hover over the bottom, and you'll see a navigation menu at the bottom. And there's a Q&A function, which is 2 little speech bubbles at the bottom. So when we get to that point of the program, and if you have a question to ask, please use the Q&A function, and either myself or one of our staff will read it out, and we'll get a response from Jorge or Wing. Also, please save the date now for March 28th, at which time we will be hosting the next Lunch and Learn, focusing on pensions for all, with all the discussion about Alberta being pulled out of the Canada Pension Plan. This will be a very informative session and one that you won't want to miss. And with that, I think I'd like to ask Jorge to kick us off with his introductory comments, especially about the current government mandate in K-12. So over to you, Jorge.
Again, thank you so much, Gil, for the introduction, and very, very happy to be here. And I'll just preface our local and the workers that we do represent. Sometimes the picture of support staff workers isn't very clear. And so we represent administrative assistants, clerks, educational assistants, interpreters, food preparers, technicians and library technicians, mentors, LPNs, and also SLPAs, which are sign language pathology assistants. And so the work that we do is important in creating the connections with the students and the families and communities that we work in. I'll just start really quickly with what happened during the pandemic and the funding cuts that happened there, where the government promised that there would be no cuts, and and then they just turned around and created and forced cuts on school boards, which definitely affected our members. The pandemic also showed, who the real heroes were, and those are the workers on the front lines, and those are the education support staff, custodians, maintenance people, and also the teachers that were the ones that worked tirelessly to support students. Add to that a frozen education budget, or the funding formula that the government introduced as well, which basically reduced the amount of money that school boards were receiving based on a formula that didn't include new students that were coming into the division in our case. So we received funding for 101,000 students, whereas we had 2,800 students that were new to the district or the division and didn't come with funding. There was no funding allocated to them because of that formula. So there is that twisted narrative that the government uses in order to not fund education. Again, we feel that a lot of that came from the need for this government to introduce or to grow that appetite for privatization. And there is a mandate, the Public Sector Employers Act, which also enforced how school boards were to bargain with support staff education workers. And that created a lot of difficulties and basically handcuffed school boards in their bargaining. And it is happening currently with our local and our division, and I'm sure it's happening with all education support staff unions across Alberta. So those are the issues that we're seeing that are causing a lot of the problems that are happening in our schools. Schools are no longer able to have a sustainable funding or to know what their funding is going to be. And so what's happening is that permanent jobs are not being created. They are now looking at how do we cut corners in order to meet the needs, and it could go to, we're having volunteer issues, where their volunteers are being asked to come and do the work of our support staff. And also reduction in FTEs, which are full-time equivalences. So a lot of our members have been asked to lower their 7-hour workday to less than 7 hours in order to keep one person working, or not to lay off one person. And so it's creating a lot of issues when it comes to our pensions, CPP contributions and LAPP contributions. So many issues happening with education that we're hoping that we can bring awareness to Albertans. So many things that need to change.
Well, thanks very much, Jorge. Wing, I'd be interested in your perspective. When people here in Alberta hear about public services, when there's media coverage, it often focuses on healthcare. But based on what we just heard from Jorge, there's a huge problem of underfunding from the provincial government. And it seems like they've set things up to put the blame on the school boards and dodge accountability themselves. What's your perspective on the role of the provincial government in what's happening in our schools right now?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gil. This government came in wanting to favor choice. So that's their overall umbrella, right? They introduced choice in education, the Choice in Education Act. And what that really did was give them cover to promote choices outside of the public system. So it's not like they were augmenting alternative programming in Edmonton Public, for example. They really were ideological coming into power in 2019. And as Jorge said, with the funding being frozen at 8.3 billion for the past 3 or 4 years, that actually translates into cuts, right? Because we've had historic inflation, we've had really high insurance premiums, and of course, enrollment growth, which for a while they were able to cover because of the pandemic. But when students came back from online, it was really evident that the classrooms were much larger and more crowded because of the underfunding that took place both before and during the pandemic. Now, this government is able to offload to school boards because I think a lot of the general public don't understand how schools are funded. They can say the principal is making these cuts, the principal is doing this and this. And yeah, the principals look at their budget that comes from the school board, but the school board gets their entire funding envelope from the province. The province is the one that determines from taxation, property taxation and general revenues. It's a mix that funds the 64 public, separate, and francophone school boards in the province. There's no other way to get more money other than fundraising or cutting, right? So private revenue generation is also a form of privatization, but that is hugely inequitable, since you know that, you know, affluent communities could probably raise a couple dollars here and there for books and bleachers. But the caveat is that fundraising can't cover salaries. Legally, you can't pay staff out of that. So what is going to happen is we're going to see EAs get laid off, right? We did see that. We're going to see the support staff that are so crucial to the school community and so crucial to relational learning have job losses and not be in the school anymore. And the offloading to school boards has been effective because people don't realize privatization is not just paying tuition for a private school. Privatization is offloading government responsibility of education to private actors. So contracting private companies to deliver curriculum like finance, or even getting volunteers to come in to do the work of trained professionals like educational assistants. That's a form of privatization as well. But it all flies under the radar as just austerity, time that we need to cut spending. And it really has had detrimental effects on students.
Well, thanks, Wing. You know, for the benefit of our viewers, I was wondering if each of you could sort of paint a picture in human terms of what the approach of the current provincial government, the impacts that their approach is having first on workers and then on students in terms of their working conditions. So Jorge, can you tell us a little bit about what it's been like for your members to work in a school system that is critically underfunded in the way our system is right now?
100%. I mean, we have our members that the impact on wages and the ability to survive, not just during COVID, but now with the higher inflation, is making it very detrimental for a lot of our members that are now users of food banks. That's not what these jobs were ever created for. They should be sustainable. They should be able to allow you to survive under any economy. We saw what happened in Ontario with their labor concerns, and those were educational support staff workers that were earning $38,000, which wasn't enough. The average educational assistant earns $27,500 here in Alberta. So we are even shorter than making less than what's considered okay in down east, and they can't survive on those funds, on that kind of wages. We have, again, layoffs and difficult work, low wages layoffs and difficult working conditions. They're driving a lot of our members away from the work. Those are the issues that we're having for members in schools. We have members that are seeing students not receive support. So some of our students are in grade 12. That's, you know, in one case, a student was got their pre-university, they were admitted early admittance, but they had to maintain their grades in order to keep that university admittance. And what happened was they lost their services, and they lost the ability to get their scribes. They were told to use somebody from home. So their marks were falling at a drastic level, and a lot of our members will go out of their way then to support. This member went out of their way to support this student to ensure that he had the proper supports, but it was on their time. We see a lot of work that's being not completed because of the layoffs, but the duties at the school are still there. They still need to be done. The services still need to be provided. So a lot of our members are being stretched thin and not able to cope. And so it's causing a lot of stress issues for our members at work, which are then correlating to health issues at work that are all attributed to this kind of funding cuts and issues that school boards are dealing with, and it does come on the back of our members. We have members that love going to work, but they're just tired, very tired, feel underappreciated, and members that really want change. So we do have members that today are now ready to fight for those changes and stand up for change.
Thanks, Jorge. Those stories are pretty heartrending. I mean, it's bad enough when workers who provide what I would describe as an essential service are so grossly underpaid, but the stress that you describe and the fact that some of these crucial workers are, who love their jobs, are being pushed to the point where they feel they have no choice but to leave and look for, employment that will allow them to put a roof over their head and their food on their table. I mean, those are really tough choices. But those choices, and the stress that these workers are under, the fact that they're not giving the resources or the time to keep up, this obviously has an impact on the students in the classroom and the quality of education that we're receiving. Can you address what's happening to the workers? What does that mean for the students who they're serving?
Yes, absolutely. These issues are intricately tied together. So when you don't have enough workers or you have burnt out workers who are not supported at their jobs, what ends up happening is that these classrooms become much more complex in this way that you're having students that, because they don't get supports on one-on-one with, say, the EA that was assigned to them, now you're having the teacher running 18 different programs, right? You still have this one staff member, but doing more. And we all know in any sector, when you are not distributing the work enough, now you're just going to have a watered down quality of what is being offered. And one group of students, every student has been impacted, but one group that whose cuts have been particularly cruel towards are children with disabilities or children with complex learning needs. Now, these children can have different neurodivergences when they come to school, and the program unit funding was a type of grant that could help young children at the age of 3 and 4, which is the time of intervention, right? When you're developing, it's a critical time to intervene and to help you and to give a set of tools to succeed in reading, writing, in socializing. What the UCP did is they cut this program drastically, and they called it distributing over 12 years of K-12 for these students. That makes no sense when you're talking about a critical learning window, when you need to catch them before kindergarten. And so what's happening, sadly, is that this group of students are going either undiagnosed because there's less access to testing, less access to therapies, less access to trained professionals that can take them for a speech lesson or even do wraparound services that continue at home. That does not exist in the same volume as we had before these cuts came in. So as you can imagine, what's that going to look like for these students down the road if they're not learning or being given those crucial supports for their learning needs or complex needs? Either their parents are going to step in, that means they are exiting the job force to help in whatever way they can. No one wants to see their child suffer, but these children are suffering. They are falling through these cracks, and it's purposeful by the government, as far as I'm concerned, because they're creating these gaps. And as long as there were supports in place, that could have been a way to help them get back into the school and get back into the learning program. So that's one group, is children with complex needs who are being disproportionately impacted. The other side is the UCP removed classroom reporting. So there were grants in place that school boards could access if their classrooms were above a certain legislated or recommended level. That is removed. So now we don't even know how big classrooms have exploded to. We just have Statistics Canada that tells us teachers in Alberta have more students than any other province. So we can extrapolate that our classrooms in Alberta are the biggest in some jurisdictions than anywhere in the nation. How is that okay, considering how wealthy we are? So a big classroom means, of course, less one-on-one time. And you're just running such a huge range of learning programs because every kid's coming in at a different level, especially after the pandemic. So class sizes are, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the curriculum. The new curriculum that was rammed through for K-3 for math and English language arts, that's having real impacts on the ground in the classroom that I work in. I'm a volunteer, unfortunately. it comes down to having people in the community come and do a couple hours here and there when it should be work done by paid for EAs. There are students that will not be able to do this curriculum because it's so age inappropriate, and the teachers were not prepared or given resources actually to effectively teach the curriculum that the UCP is wanting. So all of this, I'm trying to paint a picture of how stressful it is in one particular classroom, especially when you just have a range of abilities and no resources for each student to excel and to get what they need in terms of learning.
Well, thanks, Wing. And you actually did paint a very dramatic picture of what's happening in the classrooms. One thread that I just wanted to pull a little bit is relates to the comment you shared about how Alberta classrooms are larger than classrooms in any other province. And I agree with you that that's outrageous, considering that, you know, by any definition, we're the wealthiest province in the country, whether it's, you know, GDP per capita, business investment, wages, you know, corporate and income taxes, and of course, this royalty tsunami that we're enjoying right now. If there's any province that could afford these things and that could afford to do better by its students, it's Alberta. But you know, you mentioned that we had the highest classroom size in the country. It's not just a little bit higher. We're actually quite a bit higher, right? Do you have the numbers at your fingertips? Not to put you on the spot, but I remember seeing this the other day, and I was actually blown away by the difference, right? And it's not just a question of one or two students larger. It's significantly larger. But while you look for that, well, did you find it?
Well, I think what I saw is that each teacher or the workforce of educators is 75% smaller than the national average. So if we translate that, it means, you know, like that's how many teachers we would need to have adequate classroom size. So we are exploding.
So we're short by literally thousands of teachers and other education workers to keep up with the growth in enrollment.
Exactly.
I think you'll have to add to that, sorry, Gil, is the lack of support staff that these teachers rely on in order to deliver an effective curriculum. I mean, that's the Alberta value, is that we have always promoted that these are rights that should be guaranteed to a lot of our children that are students, right? And it's a huge insult. Added to that is the fact that we are a province that is promoting austerity. I know, Wing, you mentioned that this is a government that promotes austerity, yet is forcing school boards to bargain under austerity, and yet you know, to the public, they talk about all the money that they have, the surpluses, the billions of surpluses that they have. Yet forcing school boards to bargain under austerity is just ridiculous to me. That's the insult that I think a lot of our members are feeling, and that we hope Albertans can be aware of, that it's not an appropriate way to solve this problem is by forcing austerity when you're making billions in surplus. It makes no sense.
Well, thanks, Jorge. And that there's two other things I wanted to raise, and one of them is a good jumping off point from the comment you just made, because today is budget day. In about 3 hours, or 2 hours now, our provincial government will hand down the budget that they'll take into the next election. And we've already heard from Finance Minister Taves that they will, in this budget, you'll see increases in funding to fund enrollment growth. Does that reassure you that things are going to get better for K-12 education in Alberta? And if not, why not? Maybe you could start, Wing.
Yes, I have lots to say about that. In terms of what he said about enrollment growth, that's bare minimum, right? Of course you should be funding that. That's your job as the government. But what about inflation? What about insurance? What about deferred maintenance costs? What about all those students that were unfunded last year, right? As long as they still have the weighted moving average in place, growing schools will always be penalized because of the formula that they put in. So I mean, they can give us these talking points, or I think they always say their grant injections are historic, and that's just not the case, because what we see on the ground is unfunded classrooms and also unfunded schools. The school community itself, and I'm talking about the library, I'm talking about cafeterias and people that work in the schools. They never mention that, right? They just say in the classroom, because they want funding to follow the student. And what does that lead to is funding following the student out of public schools into private schools. And this is all very intentional on their part, right? They say, we're going to fund every student, which also means students in charter and privates. And so at the same time that, yeah, they're going to maybe give 8.2 billion again this year, just as they have, that is a funding cut, right? It translates into, after you factor in that the inflation, which is actually historic, and the insurance and all of those costs that they have not made up for. I bet you they're also going to have more money going to charters and private schools, because that's their mandate. That's what they want to do, is promote choice outside of the public system. That's what we'll be looking for. We don't want that, but this is sort of the flavor of their tendencies. And we can talk more about how that's detrimental after, but the budget today, we don't have a lot of hope, unfortunately, because public education doesn't seem to be in their top issues, even though we know from this conversation and our experience that it is being destroyed, really slowly eroding over time, but it seems to be accelerating because of, you know, the lack of resources, and plus on top of the pandemic and privatization, it is accelerating the fragmentation of our public system.
Well, thanks, Wing. We'll get back to the ideological component of what's happening and the UCP's end game. But before we get there, I just want to give Jorge an opportunity to say a few things about the budget, which we're going to be seeing in about 2 hours. What are you worried you're going to see, and what would you like to see?
You know what? I went to the opening throne speech in October, and very disappointed because education was not mentioned at all. And I was hoping to write down something that I could take back to our membership, or and there was nothing there. And so the fear is that there's probably not going to be anything there, or not enough. Maybe something to twist the narrative that, hey, we're giving a little bit more, but I'm scared that there won't be enough of that. You know, I would love to see, with any kind of increase of funding, that they would let go of that Public Sector Employers Act. That needs to go. Those are the things that we want to see. And of course, the increase in funding that will allow us to bargain fairly for our members and bring these issues to the bargaining table. Seeing the agenda, the privatization agenda that exists. We saw it with healthcare. We were at the rallies for healthcare. We saw what was happening. We knew it was coming to education, and we do see it in terms of infrastructure funding that Edmonton Public didn't get. And so that is the fear, that there might be something, but not enough to impact our salaries in terms of inflation and the services that students desperately need.
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. We just got a question in the chat about maintenance of older school buildings and also the construction of new schools. Is that's obviously a problem and something that needs to be addressed in the budget. Could either of you address the infrastructure problems that are being faced by our school boards around the province?
Yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure problems that at least the Edmonton School Division is suffering from. One, lack of funding for new schools. I don't believe there was anything mentioned there for the Edmonton Public School Division, and also the urban sprawl that's also happening, that has affected a lot of schools. One, creating the need for new schools, but at the same time, all the older schools that need to be renovated and kept up to, and maintained and kept up to standards, right? And the funding there just wasn't there. So yeah, we do see it in that sense as well.
And it is a province-wide problem. Outside of Edmonton, I know in a rural/urban mixed district, there are 40-year-old portables that I attended. And every year, each school board can only put forward 1 or 2 projects to be considered by infrastructure. So capital costs are a different budget line for education, and there definitely is not enough there. 40-year-old portables, right? So these schools are expanding, but because we could never keep up with the growth, these schools are falling apart in some areas. They don't have enough bathrooms because they're at like 96% capacity the moment they open, even if a new school, is like, ribbon cutting day and they're at 96% capacity, because that's how far behind we are. We're years behind in keeping up with the urban sprawl that you mentioned. The other side also is who's going to work in the schools. Yeah, we do need new schools, especially in Southwest Edmonton. We need new high school, but who's going to staff it? Who are going to be the educators in there? It's just like when they say in healthcare, we'll just buy more ambulances. Well, who's going to work in those ambulances? Who's going to drive them? So we have the same problems, right? I think it's really easy to promise new buildings. People love the idea of new shiny glass buildings, but the core of the problem is staffing. 90% of school budget goes to staffing, and that's not addressed. So moving forward, we need to inoculate ourselves against the rhetoric that we just need new buildings. We actually need more staff. We need more educators and support staff and more resources for the students that go to these new schools.
Yeah, well, thanks, Wing. And ironically, I just came from a meeting of healthcare workers, and it's the same story there. And in fact, the labor shortages in healthcare are probably getting more attention than the labor shortages in education. But maybe I could ask Jorge to pull on that thread a little bit, because the K-12 system is not getting the attention in terms of the impacts of labor shortages. How bad is the labor shortage on the front lines in K-12? And if you could just sort of flesh that out and talk a little bit about what it means for your members and the public.
It's terrible. That's the best I could say is that it's terrible. We have members. We've never had members being laid off in October, and which we're experiencing. The shorting of funds for a lot of our schools doesn't allow them to be able to provide the services that they desperately need, essentially. And what it's forcing them to do is create cuts, different ways of cutting, taking away positions, duties, lowering FTEs. And so many schools are getting by barely getting by, if they can get by at all. And a lot of our members are seeing that. They are doing the extra work from, like I said, the duties don't change, the needs don't change. And so the members that they do keep, their employees that they do keep, are stretched to now cover those duties. And they're being worked to the point now where a lot of them are being sick. They're being driven to, higher, I think higher than normal. We have no supply staff. The school boards have a supply staff shortage. That is a big key component, is that if someone is off sick now, there's nobody covering or coming in to cover those hours that or those needs that the student needs for a person that's sick. So our members are now, some feel so bad about not taking time off sick that they'll come into work sick, just because they know that that student will not get the services or the support that they need. And so it's creating a huge conflict. It is, I don't know if they're trying to attempt division, but yeah, people are now doing a lot more work than what they were used to, and what the norm was. Yeah, well, I think the picture that you're painting is a shocking one for people who aren't, on the front lines in the school community, because on one hand, as you've said, enrollment is growing, especially in the cities here in Alberta. Everyone acknowledges that there's a labor shortage, but school boards are actually laying people off
which just exacerbates the labor shortage and also all the problems associated with it that you just described. So I mean, it just boggles my mind as a parent and as someone who values our public health, public education system, that while at the same time enrollment is growing, the population is growing, the government is going out of its way to try to attract people to move to Alberta. And we also have these huge surpluses. So, and we understand there's a labor shortage, but we're still laying people off. I mean, like, that just boggles my mind. Wing, like, how is, how is this justifiable in any sense? And why aren't we talking about it more?
I always think about that because it seems like education has become such an individualized commodity. Maybe we think about it as long as my kid is okay, then I'm not going to care too much, and we know maybe people still have enough resources to help their particular child. But for SOS, and I know for the people on this call, we all understand public education is for the public good. We need to have a robust education system that's accessible to all students. Students with neurodivergences, students who are not from a wealthy family, they should have quality education that serves them as well as the greater community. It's not just a product that you can buy and get by. So I think that mentality, of like, well, Alberta is rich, and we're still pretty up there in our education system. We need to destroy that narrative. We need to talk to people and talk to our neighbors and say, hey, this is actually happening in our public schools. Like, our community public schools are suffering. And of course, educators and education workers are going to stretch themselves to the end. We know that. I know that people that work in education do it on the for the most part for the cause. But in a way that helps the government carry on, because it's like, well, no one's saying anything, so it's fine. So I think the more we talk about how bad it is, like, it is hard to work in a school. You don't have any boundaries. You're going home and some teachers are going to students' classes or students' homes at night to drop off, work or check in. There is a lot of that going on under the table because there's just what other way, there's no other way to provide the services that are, because you're not paid for it. You're doing a lot of unpaid work is what I'm trying to say. And that's not sustainable. That shouldn't be the way either. We should be paying workers fairly to deliver quality education. So I guess to answer your question, why education is not getting the attention, I think we've bought into the narrative that this is, every family for themselves. Go to a big school that has lots of resources and you'll be fine, but that's not sustainable. And soon we are going to see this generation that's missing out on educational opportunities that is going to manifest in our society.
Yeah.
If I can just add,
go ahead, Jorge. Yeah.
We're also seeing a lot, like Wing had mentioned as well, we are seeing families that are trying to resolve these issues themselves, as opposed to coming together and complaining and creating the issue and making it an issue for them to get those services that they have a right to, that they deserve, that they should be guaranteed. Instead, parents are looking at, and just like we do with health, a lot of what that does is create that appetite to then fork out money out of your pocket, which you didn't budget for, to have those services for your child. So it's that slow moving push to private services for many families without them realizing that they can make a difference, especially now that it's election time.
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. That's a really good segue to the final topic that I want to discuss, and that's the ideological end game, right? Not like, as both of you have said, all of this is not an accident. It's by design. Maybe I'll just open it up to you guys. What do you think is going on here? Why is the UCP, which is, presides over a very wealthy government, why are they being so miserly? Why are they cutting supports for students in schools? Is that this is not just a question about them trying to balance the budget, is it? Wing?
No, I think balancing a budget is just their cover. what they really want is more charter schools. So the UCP comes from a strict neoliberal order of wanting lots of private options because they believe in small government. They believe that government should take their hands out of everyday lives of individual families. So we've seen this play out in other areas like the US and in the UK. And being the province, the only province with legislated charter schools, and the UCP removed a cap. So they want to see tons of charter schools come in, set up shop in our neighborhoods, because the agenda or the ideology behind that is that this creates innovation and competition within schools, so we get the best education programming if you make kids compete for programs. And already you can see how immorally wrong that is. When you make kids compete, you are saying some kids win and some kids lose. That is the implication. You know, you're going to have kids that don't have access to these charter programs because of where they live. Or what's really going to happen though, and we see this play out in Calgary actually, is that when a charter school opens, it siphons the community's population of students and they skim off the top. So charter schools can admit whoever they want and exclude whoever they want. And charter schools don't have to admit children with complex needs. They're actually exempt in the Education Act. They're exempt from accommodating, you know, and they say like, we'll try our best, but there's so much permission written in the act as is to let them be unregulated. So they're selecting their exclusive body of students. And what's going to happen in that public school? What's going to happen in that public school down the street? We already know, you know, they're going to be left with the more complex classrooms, the less resources, because those are going to the charter school. They're 100% publicly funded from my pocket, your pocket. We're paying for the charter schools that are not producing a public benefit. And the UCP wants more of that. They've even given $72 million in capital costs on top of operating instructional grants. So that's where they're headed. The other side is they might increase the already 70% subsidization rate to private schools. These are accredited private entities that can turn a profit and charge tuition to, you know, the tune of $20,000 a year. We have 19 private schools that charge more than $12,000 a year in Alberta. These are wealthy schools that make extra money from more affluent families. So all of this aside, you know, and Danielle Smith has already floated the idea of vouchers, which we've seen in the States. That means your student is carrying their full pot of tax dollars to private entities and leaving the public system. And that is going to be absolutely disastrous for our province in terms of education, because now we're not going to have not even close to the amount of resources we need for the public system, and you're going to get segregation of those who have and those who don't, and they're taking tax dollars with them.
Yeah, thanks, Wing. I think it's really important for our viewers to understand the two of the policies that you just mentioned. You mentioned that the UCP has removed the cap on charter schools, and then you also mentioned that under the UCP and frankly under previous Alberta governments, we spend a lot of public money on private schools, more than other provinces, and that makes us different. And it also, both of those things threaten public education, the quality of public education and the accessibility, right? So maybe if you can just give a little background on that, you know, the decision to remove the cap. What was the cap? Why was it there? Why does it matter? And then also if you could explain a little bit more about how much we spend, Alberta spends on public education versus other provinces, like in terms of on private schools, I mean, compared to other provinces.
Yeah, so first for charter schools, we got them imported, or Ralph Klein introduced them in 1994. And this was during the age of austerity, you know, another age of austerity back in the 90s, when he cut public services by 12% or more, but then introduced a lot of private options, including these charter schools. Originally, they were going to be testing beds for new pedagogies or new learning styles and, you know, all this flowery marketing. And it's now 2023, and some of these charter schools still exist. because their charters are 5-year terms that can just be renewed by the minister. So there's no public oversight of how a charter school is run, why they run. They just get money to operate, and they're governed by unelected people. And that's key here, because public school boards are governed by broad elections, or the people are elected through broad elections in the community, and that's separate francophone and public. Charter schools have their own nonprofit board of directors who can belong to all sorts of strange affiliations. We have, the Classical Academy that's being run by a former UCP candidate with very problematic white supremacist links, according to some articles. So it's this complete lack of oversight that is dangerous to not just the students going, because now they're vulnerable to whatever this learning style or curriculum is that the charter school is delivering without accountability. The other side is that we're paying for it. That the general community is underwriting these programs of choice without ever having these programs rolled back in the public system, because if there was a benefit. We don't have statistics about whether these testing beds are working, if they're providing more innovation or providing any enrichment of any sort. Our public systems already have a lot of branches and a lot of alternative programming to accommodate interests or sports and arts and science. So why do they exist? Why do charter schools need to exist? They should be folded back in the public system. The other policy was the subsidization of private schools. So it started back in the 60s when, private entities that are not governed by any, government affiliation, not elected, they're really companies, right? They're corporations that deliver education for an elite group, an excluded group of students. Since I think 1960, we gave each school $100 per student, saying, okay, well, this is a way to help you. And over time, through consecutive conservative governments, it was raised to, okay, now you're going to get more operational grants as private entities. It was raised to 60% in 1997. And then now, I think as of 2008, we are sitting at 70% of the instructional grant that goes to each student. We as taxpayers subsidize 70%. On top of any tuition that we don't get our hands on, right? The tuition that the school can charge. And we are sitting at the highest rate of subsidization in the country. I think Saskatchewan discussed maybe going to 75%. But you can see how problematic this is when we are already paying for what should be a quality public education system and then diverting much needed public resources to mostly affluent private entities. So this is, not different from the cleanup of the oil wells. We're just really subsidizing business. We're subsidizing corporate interests over public interest. And unfortunately, that might go up, because what the UCP government has kept saying is private schools need to be more treated more fairly. They need to be matched with what we're investing in public. And these are talking points that people somehow have bought over the years. If you go and get a book from Chapters, apparently the government will pay you for that book because you didn't go to the library. Like this sort of mentality that you get a rebate if you opt out of a public system is incredibly problematic here in Alberta.
Yeah, thanks, Wing. Jorge, as someone who represents frontline workers in the public K-12 system, how does that make you feel when you see literally billions of dollars of public money going to these private educational outfits, sometimes for-profit groups who are getting public money that could be used to help support our public system? How does that make you feel?
Well, it makes our members feel angry, but a lot of the public doesn't know that that's what's happening, and that's what the government's doing. But we are seeing, and it's very clear that what we're seeing is that this kind of privatization, in order for it to work, it's forcing school boards to basically race to the bottom. And it's forcing school boards to have to follow these mandates that basically put them way at the bottom, and it's going to force the erosion of the public school board system or the public education system. And everyone knows it, everyone's aware of it. And so it's, how do we fight this? And that's what we're looking at. And we strongly believe that in order to fight the race to the bottom, we have to get to the top. And I think a lot of school boards need to realize that strong collective agreements that can raise the standards of attracting labor to public education, fund public education, that's what's going to create that barrier against privatization, because then privatize all you want, it won't work, because where the stronger collective agreement, where the stronger labor is, would be with the public system. And so, and then it has to be funded, right? And so that's what we hope to do. We hope that a lot of our locals that are public education support staff locals are in bargaining, that they fight for good collective agreements, fight against this mandate, especially the wage increase, which I think narrows down to about 2.75%. Which we can talk about in another hour, I think. But that's what we need to do, is find all the locals to stand up, and for school boards to also be a part of that solution to promote public education and save it. That's where this government has taken us to, is that this is a collective solution with everybody, and it can be found. It can really be found. And we also need to elect a government that's going to promote that.
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. In the final few minutes that we have left, maybe I could ask both of you to sum up about what needs to happen. And, if you have a message for the public about K-12 education, if you could sum it up, what would it be? First Wing, and then maybe Jorge.
Yeah, I would say that our public education system has been, the top of its class in the world for a long time, despite these privatization measures, because of our prosperity. We've been able to maintain a really robust public schooling system open to all children. That is in imminent risk, because we can only accept so much strain in our public schools. We can only do so much and burn out only so many workers before we have a problem where our students are not getting the education they need to be, first of all, for themselves, right? To be good citizens or be educated. But we're going to see our communities lose adhesion. We're going to see our communities fragment when your community public school is not there anymore. There are 16 schools slated for closure in the public system in Calgary because of charters and privatization and underfunding, because they're losing students and they have a utilization rate to follow. So when these public schools are on the chopping board, what's going to happen to your neighborhood? Because now you're not going to have a community school that's publicly funded. Where are your children going to go to be educated together? And that's going to lead into neighbors not knowing each other, right? This all flows out when we don't have a pillar of democracy that is public education holding our society together. So that's what I would say is, what kind of Alberta do you see? Do you see a cohesive one where we're trying to move our communities forward? We have crises right now that we are facing, economically, socially, politically. Do you see that? Do you see fighting that with your neighbor, or do you see not knowing who your neighbors are at all and doing this all alone because your children are going to completely different schools, or even your public school is not supported, so it's not a good education they're getting there?
Yeah, well said. There's just a tremendous amount of downstream impacts that will result from the UCP's efforts to privatize, to undermine the public system and open the door for more private. And a lot of these impacts people just don't think about. But I'm very glad that you've been that you very effectively connected those dots. Jorge, in the last few minutes that we have, what would your message be to Albertans on the subject of K-12 education, especially in the context of this budget we're going to see today, and the upcoming provincial election, which is now just about 90 days away?
Yeah, and thanks, Gil. And basically it is to realize that we have a province that is enjoying surpluses. We have to be very clear on that. We cannot tolerate any austerity talk because there is no reason for it. And for families to fight having to pay out of their pockets for the rights of their children to be educated by the province, by the education system. And if we are going into an election and if you're on the fence, if Albertans are on the fence on who to vote for, to please support the party that's going to help your child and that's going to promote public education and proper funding for education, because it's important to you and your families. And so we are hoping that that will be hopefully the convincing to be able to convince you to vote for education and vote for the party that promotes it. And that's our hope.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. I think we could probably talk for another hour. But on behalf of the Alberta Federation of Labor and all the people who have joined us today for this Lunch and Learn session, I really want to thank our two guests today, Wing Lee from Support Our Students, an advocacy group of parents concerned about K-12 education in the province, and also Jorge Illanes, who is the president of CUPE 3550, representing frontline K-12 education support workers in Edmonton and the Edmonton public school system. So thanks very much to both of you for a really enlightening and engaging conversation. It's been great. And for those who are interested, we have been taping this session. It'll be up on YouTube in a day or two. And if you like this session, please consider sharing it with your friends once we have the link up, and we will promote that from the Alberta Federation of Labor. Finally, I want to just remind people that we are going to be doing another Lunch and Learn session on pensions on March 28th. That's our next scheduled Lunch and Learn. Please mark that in your calendar. And finally, I'd just like to thank our AFL staff who helped make this installment of our Lunch and Learn session a success today. So thank you to Beth and to MC, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.